My family didn't RSVP to my wedding. They rerouted their tickets to Italy and left me to figure it out from a flight confirmation email. I spent $32,000 flying them to paradise, and they picked pasta over me. That's when I learned, you can't buy love, but you can accidentally fund someone's Mediterranean cruise trying. I'm Camilla Stone, 35, a tech venture strategist living in Austin, and until this happened, I still clung to the belief that maybe success could fix what history couldn't, that a beachside wedding with all expenses paid might finally get my parents to look at me like I mattered. I thought if I gave them everything, first-class flights, a luxury resort, spa treatments, welcome gifts, surely they'd meet me halfway. Instead, they went halfway across the world. It had all started so beautifully. Reed, my fiancé, had proposed on a frozen lake in Colorado with a vintage emerald ring and words so tender they stopped time. "I want to build the rest of my life around yours," he said. It was the kind of moment I didn't know people like me could have. Messy family, old wounds, years of being overlooked. But Reed made it possible. We planned the wedding ourselves. We didn't want excess, but we wanted meaning, the ocean, sunset vows, warmth, and joy. Tulum, Mexico checked every box. The Solara resort had this barefoot elegance to it, white sand, coral-accented suites, a chef who did private tasting menus, and fire dancers if you wanted them. We hired Sasha Navarro, an elite planner who balanced detail with grace. Every call left me excited. But there was always one piece I hesitated on: my family. Reed's parents were thrilled. His brothers joked about who'd cry first during the vows. His aunt mailed me a monogrammed veil with a note that made me cry in the middle of a work meeting. But my side? Quiet, distant, like someone had turned the volume down on their end of the connection. Still, I made the call. "Hi, Mom," I said, 2 months after locking in the venue. "I wanted to talk to you and Dad about the wedding. It's in October. We're doing it in Mexico." "Mexico," she said, flat. "That's quite far, Camilla." "I know. That's why I want to take care of everything. First-class flights from Nashville, 10 nights at the resort, transportation, all of it. You, Dad, Dylan, Lauren, the kids. It's on me." A long silence. Then, "That's generous of you." "I just want you there," I said. "We're making it small and meaningful. I want family around us." "We'll talk to Dylan and see if it works with their schedule," she replied. No questions about the resort. No joy in her voice, just logistics. Still, I booked it. $32,118 in total. I even paid a little extra to have their welcome baskets include embroidered robes and handwritten notes from Reed and me. The travel agent, Lisi, said I was one of the most detailed clients she'd worked with. I told her it was because it was the one trip I couldn't afford to go wrong. Reed looked worried when I showed him the invoice. "You don't have to spend this much to prove anything," he said gently. "I'm not proving anything," I lied. "I'm just giving them no excuse." Over the next month, our plans bloomed. My dress arrived, ivory silk, custom-tailored. The menu was finalized: citrus ceviche, grilled mahi-mahi, coconut tres leches. Sasha secured the florist I'd wanted since I was 25. My RSVP list grew. Everyone from our shared life, friends, colleagues, my old roommate Janelle, couldn't wait. Everyone except them. When I called to check on passports, my mother told me they were looking into it. Dylan never answered his phone. Lauren texted me once about her kids' peanut allergies, but never followed up. I should have known, but I didn't want to know. Not yet. Until my Aunt Linda, my mom's younger sister, left me a cheery voicemail one Sunday. "Camilla, your mom mentioned they were planning a big Mediterranean cruise in the fall. Italy, Greece, I think? Dylan's whole family, too. What a dream trip." I paused. The same week as the wedding, I logged into the airline portal using the confirmation code I'd sent my parents. One of the reservations had been modified, a destination change request, from Cancun to Naples. I called the airline. A representative confirmed the attempted reroute and explained it hadn't been processed because the cost difference wasn't covered. My hands shook as she read the new itinerary request. Departure October 13th, Return, October 23rd. My wedding was on October 18th. They weren't coming. They never intended to. And worse, they were trying to take the very gift I had given in good faith and twist it into something just for them. That night, I sat on the floor with Reed beside me. I didn't cry. I didn't even speak. I just handed him the email. He read it, his jaw tightening, and then put his arm around me. "They don't deserve to be part of this," he said. "I know," I whispered, "but it still hurts." "They chose a vacation over your vows," he said. "You gave them everything, and they turned it into a travel upgrade. But what do you do when the people you paid to show up never planned to?" There's a certain kind of grief that doesn't come from losing something, but from realizing it was never really yours. That's what hit me after I found out my family had tried to reroute their flights to Italy instead of coming to my wedding. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the cold, final confirmation of something I had tried to ignore for decades, that when it came to love and loyalty in our family, I was always optional. I should have known. The signs weren't new. They were just louder this time. Because in our family, the center of attention has always been reserved for one person, my brother Dylan. Dylan, 2 years younger than me, was born into applause. He cried dramatically as a baby, and my mom called it leadership energy. He ran late, forgot homework, faked fevers, and my parents spun it as charm. I, on the other hand, followed every rule. I colored inside the lines. I earned straight A's. I asked for nothing, and that became my role, the quiet achiever who didn't need much. But here's the thing about being the quiet one. No one notices when you start unraveling. I still remember the day I got accepted into Vanderbilt. I walked into the kitchen, letter trembling in my hand, beaming. My mom glanced up from her phone, smiled slightly, and said, "That's nice, honey. Can you drive Dylan to practice in an hour?" They threw a party for Dylan when he passed pre-calculus on the second try, but my academic scholarship didn't earn a single candle. Back then, I told myself they just didn't understand me, that maybe I was too independent, too self-sufficient, that if I just gave more, showed up more, they'd see me, really see me. And I kept believing that well into adulthood. Every earned promotion, every dinner I insisted on paying for, every holiday I hosted so they didn't have to lift a finger, I kept hoping, maybe this is the moment I become enough. So of course I thought the wedding would finally be it. My fiancé Reed adored me, our friends were excited, my colleagues were flying in. Reed's family, warm, present, thoughtful, were calling me every week to ask how they could help. And still, I held out hope that my parents and Dylan would take this opportunity to show up. Not just physically, but emotionally. I wanted it so badly it blinded me. That's why I offered to cover everything. First-class comfort, beachfront suites, welcome baskets embroidered with their initials, even private airport transfers so they wouldn't have to lift a finger. I didn't just remove excuses, I funded their yes. And when the silence came anyway, I told myself they were just busy. I didn't know until I checked that flight confirmation email that they were planning something else entirely. A cruise through Italy, scheduled for the exact same week as my wedding. I still remember the click of my phone as I called Dylan, praying there was a misunderstanding. He answered on the third ring like nothing was wrong. "I didn't waste time. Are you going to my wedding or Europe?" A pause. "Cam, don't be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm asking a question." He sighed. "Look, the Italy trip just made more sense. Lauren didn't want to deal with customs and dragging the kids through airports. Europe's more educational for them anyway. The wedding, it just sounded complicated." My jaw locked. My heart didn't break. It braced. "You mean the wedding I paid for? The one you never responded to? You didn't even have to click book. I did everything for you." "Yeah? Well, you always make things about proving a point." That line split something open in me. It wasn't surprise, it was recognition. That's how they saw me. Not as someone reaching out, not as someone trying to connect, just someone putting on a show. "I invited you because you're my brother," I said, voice breaking. He didn't respond. "And you're still going to Italy?" "We already paid a deposit," he said. "It'd be dumb to lose it." Right. But it wasn't dumb to let me lose thousands of dollars, or my dignity. I hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't cry right away. That came later. What I felt in that moment was worse. It was clarity, like the last light in a long hallway finally flickered out. It was the silence between us finally speaking. It was the last excuse dissolving. That night, I sat on the bedroom floor surrounded by floral samples and RSVP cards. Reed walked in, saw my face, and dropped to his knees beside me. I didn't have to say a word. I handed him my phone with the text log open. He read it all, eyebrows drawing together. "So they're not coming." They never were. He took my hands. "You don't need to chase anyone who makes you feel like a burden for inviting them to love you." I wanted to argue, but I was too tired. He was right. I had spent years performing emotional acrobatics for people who didn't even glance up. I had mistaken effort for closeness, money for connection. And now I was sitting in a pile of orchids and receipts, realizing I was the only one who ever wanted this to feel like a real family. So I did something I had never done before. I stopped leaving the door open. I stopped explaining the hurt. I stopped asking to be seen. Weddings are supposed to be full of joyful calls, the excited shriek of your best friend when you tell her the date, the trembling voice of your father asking what time to walk you down the aisle, the motherly squeals about flowers and menus. I had none of that. What I had was silence. Then a rerouted ticket, then a voicemail from my brother that turned my wedding joy into wedding day heartbreak. And yet, I kept checking my phone. It's strange how hope works. Even when you've been given every reason to stop hoping, it lingers, thin, stubborn, irrational. The day after that conversation with Dylan, I told myself maybe he'd call back and apologize. Maybe my parents hadn't known what he was doing. Maybe someone, anyone, would reach out and say, "We'll be there." They didn't. What I got instead was a text from my mother 3 days later. "Camilla, I think it's time you stop making everything about yourself. You're not the only person in this family who matters." I stared at the screen, numb. Reed was making coffee in the kitchen, humming softly. I handed him the phone. He read it in silence, then placed it face down on the counter. "She said that to her daughter," he muttered. "Who invited them, paid for them, wanted them there." I shook my head. "She always thinks I'm trying to make her look bad. That's been the story since I was a teenager. She does that fine on her own." I wished I could laugh, but the ache in my chest wasn't funny. Our planner Sasha had warned us that destination weddings could get tricky, travel issues, scheduling problems, financial burdens. But this wasn't about logistics. This was about being unwanted in my own family. It wasn't that they couldn't come. It was that they wouldn't. And they were willing to lie, manipulate, and guilt me to protect that choice. Still, the show had to go on. I threw myself back into planning. Sasha and I finalized the seating chart, quietly removing 6 place cards and shifting table assignments to make the head count less noticeable. I called the resort and adjusted the room bookings. I revised the welcome bags, removing the items personalized for my parents' and brother's kids. Reed never pushed, he just kept being steady, kind, present. "You don't have to make it perfect," he said one night, seeing the bags under my eyes after a midnight email sprint. "You just have to make it true." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. True. I had spent so much of my life pretending things were fine with my family, pretending they loved me the way they said they did, pretending their absence was about circumstances, not choice. But none of it was true. So I stopped pretending. I called my Aunt Linda, the only member of my family who had reached out with kindness and sincerity. She had sent me a card when we got engaged, even though she wasn't sure she'd be invited. She'd written, "Camilla, I've watched you grow into a brilliant, compassionate woman. You deserve joy without apology. If I can be there for you, I will." When she answered the phone, I broke down crying. "Oh, sweetheart," she said immediately. "What happened?" I told her everything. The silence, the rerouted tickets, the cruise, the text from my mother. She listened, not interrupting, not trying to fix anything, just present. And then she said, "Camilla, I'd be honored to attend your wedding. Even if I have to come alone, even if I sit in the back. You won't be alone unless you choose to be." I cried harder at that than I had when Dylan bailed. Over the next week, Linda helped in small ways, coordinating with Sasha, mailing out a second round of RSVPs to extended family I hadn't even considered inviting. A few distant cousins replied yes. One great aunt, who hadn't seen me since I was 9, sent a video message saying how proud she was of me. It wasn't a flood of affection, but it was enough. It reminded me that chosen family sometimes comes from the branches we forget to water. Meanwhile, the wedding press team reached out to confirm the publication would like to feature our event. Sasha had connections with an upscale bridal magazine and submitted our story. They loved the setting, the intimacy, the backstory. They didn't know the full backstory, and I didn't tell them. But the thought that my wedding would be shared, celebrated, seen, it soothed something raw inside me. A week before departure, Reed and I sat in the living room with our suitcases half packed. The resort sent over a final confirmation with a list of all arriving guests. My family's names were still on the manifest. "Should I cancel the bookings?" I asked. Reed thought for a moment. "Leave them. Let them show their true selves." "Even if they still try to come last minute?" He shrugged. "If they show up, we deal with it. But at least we'll know who they are." That night, I got a notification on my phone. Dylan had posted photos on Instagram. "Mediterranean countdown begins." A picture of his kids in matching backpacks, my parents smiling at a cruise brochure. The caption, "Can't wait for gelato, gondolas, and guilt-free family time." Guilt-free. That was the knife. They were flaunting it. Flaunting the fact that they'd chosen a vacation over my vows. Over my love. Over everything I had tried to build between us. I turned off the phone and stood in the dark, my heart tight. "You okay?" Reed asked, coming up behind me. "I will be," I whispered, "because I'm finally done waiting for them to care." I used to believe betrayal came with drama, a slammed door, a shouted accusation, something you could point to and say, "There." That's the moment it all changed. But it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes betrayal is quiet. It's a missing RSVP, a flight that never gets booked, a message that reads, "Guilt-free family time," while you're folding your wedding dress into a garment bag alone. It hit me the morning after Dylan posted those cruise photos. I sat at our kitchen table, staring at the itemized invoice Sasha had sent for the final wedding logistics. I had paid for 6 people who were never coming. First-class flights, $8,100. Beachfront resort suite, $5,800. Villa for Dylan's family, $6,400. Group transportation, welcome baskets, spa credit, $2,600. Excursions, meals, tips, transfers, adjustments, $32,118.14 to be exact. I could hear Reed in the next room, taking a work call, his voice calm and focused. The sun was shining through the blinds like it didn't know what had happened, like the world hadn't shifted under me. They weren't coming, and worse, they never even said it. No call, no apology, just an Instagram caption with their vacation plans. My phone buzzed. A message from the airline, one of those generic pre-departure reminders. It listed all 6 family members under my booking. Kindly confirm traveler details for upcoming trip to Cancun. The names sat on the screen like ghosts. Richard Stone, Ellen Stone, Dylan Stone, Lauren Stone, 2 children. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just hit cancel all on the reservation and typed out a refund request. Then I forwarded the confirmation to Reed and Sasha without commentary. Sasha replied within 10 minutes, "Camilla, I'm sorry. Let's reclaim this day for you. We'll make it beautiful anyway." And that word stuck in my head like a heartbeat. Reclaim. Because up until that point, this wedding had been something I built while still waiting for my family to participate. Even as I designed it with Reed, I'd left room for them, emotionally, physically, symbolically. But they had never left room for me. They'd filled their spaces with Dylan's wins, Dylan's kids, Dylan's needs. My role was to cheer quietly from the sidelines, and now I was done being a spectator. So I reclaimed the empty places. I called Sasha and changed the seating chart again. We expanded tables for friends who had RSVP'd yes. I offered +1s to colleagues who had planned to come solo. We added my Aunt Linda to the front row, directly behind Reed's parents. I asked Sasha to replace my father's name on the ceremony program with "escorted by someone who chose to be here." The florist asked if we still wanted 6 extra centerpieces. I told her to double the order and have them donated to the local Tulum women's shelter after the reception. Each change felt like a tiny stitch in a seam that had long been tearing open. I didn't need them to walk me down the aisle anymore. I didn't need them in the family photo. I needed to stop begging people to love me and start honoring the people who already did. Reed saw the change in me almost immediately. "You seem lighter," he said one night as we packed. "I think I finally stopped waiting." For what? For them to become the people I needed them to be. He smiled and pulled me into his arms. "They don't get to hold that space anymore. You do." The next few days passed in a blur of prep and final emails. Aunt Linda offered to arrive early and help Sasha with setup. Reed's mom confirmed her speech, and his youngest niece sent me a voice note. "I can't wait to see your dress, Aunt Cammy." I listened to that message twice a day like a prescription. On the day before we flew out, I got a final email from the travel concierge. All wedding guests had been confirmed except one set, my parents. Even though I'd canceled their flights, their room bookings hadn't been officially voided. The resort needed confirmation. I stared at the screen. There was a time when I might have forwarded that message to my mother, given her one last chance, left the door cracked. But now, I wrote back, "Cancel the suite. Remove them from the manifest. They will not be attending." It felt like drawing a boundary in permanent ink. That night, I received one final email from my mother. No subject line, no greeting. Just this. "We saw that you canceled our room. Your aunt always loved stirring drama. You'll regret cutting your family out of your wedding." I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Reed and then archived the thread. Because I had made the room. I had extended the invitation. I had left space over and over again. And now I was making something else. Peace. As Reed and I boarded our flight the next morning, the sunrise spilled across the tarmac like a second chance. I looked at him and said, "We're not losing a family this week. We're building one." And I meant every word. I had already made peace with the silence, or at least I told myself I had. After the final emails were sent, the manifest trimmed, and the refund processed, I tried to shift my focus. There were still menus to finalize, playlists to approve, last-minute fittings and travel bags to pack. But silence has a way of humming beneath everything. Even the happiest moments felt like they had a shadow behind them. That's when Aunt Linda called me, her voice unusually clipped. "Camilla, I wasn't going to show you this, but I think you deserve to see it before someone else does." Then she forwarded the group chat screenshot. It was from a family thread I hadn't been part of in years. At the top, a photo of my parents and Dylan's family, smiling in matching outfits on a luxury cruise deck. The caption said, "Mediterranean escape with my favorites. Sorry we had to miss the wedding chaos." The timestamp was 3 days before our wedding. It took a second for my brain to compute what I was looking at, not because I didn't expect it, but because they hadn't even tried to hide it. They were supposed to be too busy. That was what Dylan had said on the phone. That was what my mom vaguely mumbled months ago when I pressed her for confirmation. But they weren't too busy. They had booked a cruise, a lavish, multi-port European escape, during the exact dates of my wedding. And the worst part? They were bragging about it. My name wasn't mentioned. The word wedding only appeared as a passive insult, wedding chaos, as if it were some messy obligation they'd heroically escaped. I stared at the image and felt something crack, not break, because breaking implies something sharp and sudden. This was quieter, deeper, like an old foundation giving way after years of pressure. I had known my place in the family. I'd lived with it, tolerated it, even dressed it up in optimism. But now they had confirmed it publicly. They had essentially announced to the world that I wasn't worth rearranging a vacation for, that their happiness existed completely separate from mine. I sent the photo to Reed without a message. He called me instantly. "Camilla, I swear, if I could fly to that ship and drag them off myself, I would." I laughed bitterly. "You can't fix this one, babe. But you don't have to carry it alone, and you don't have to let it walk down the aisle with you." That night, I sat on the balcony of our hotel suite and reread the post again, not to punish myself, but to memorize what the truth looked like in daylight. Because sometimes, even after someone shows you who they are, you keep hoping they'll become something else. I didn't want to hope anymore. I wanted to document, to internalize, to accept. The next morning, I told Sasha to remove the family tribute slideshow from the welcome dinner. I replaced the photo montage with clips of our travels, our friends, and silly moments Reed and I had filmed over the years, the people who had actually been part of our story. Guests started arriving that afternoon. Hugs, laughter, sun hats, and sandals filled the resort. Reed's aunt brought a necklace she'd worn on her wedding day and slipped it into my hand. Reed's college roommate gave a toast at the welcome dinner that had half the room crying and the other half howling with laughter. And still, a part of me kept waiting for the ache to resurface, for the disappointment to flood back in, but it didn't. Not the way I feared. It lingered, sure, but in the way a scar does. It reminds you of what healed, not of what still hurts. Later that evening, I scrolled through my messages and saw that my mother had viewed the wedding link I'd shared weeks ago, the one with the venue and itinerary. No message followed, no apology, just a read receipt. That was it. The final interaction before my wedding. A silent click. And still, I chose not to reach back, not to ask for anything more, because for the first time I wasn't mourning their absence. I was noticing how full the room already was, and the wedding hadn't even begun yet. The morning before the ceremony, I stood in front of the mirror in my suite, barefoot on the cool marble floor, staring at the garment bag hanging from the doorframe. It was still zipped, untouched since it arrived 2 weeks ago. I had tried it on once, quickly, under fluorescent light, still unsure if I could carry the moment it represented. But now, with the ceremony just hours away, it was time to decide whether I'd wear my pain or my pride down the aisle. Reed was out deep-sea fishing with his cousins. The resort was quiet. The ocean murmured low beyond the glass doors. I turned on soft jazz from my playlist and poured a glass of champagne, even though it was barely 9 a.m. Then, slowly, I walked toward the dress and unzipped the garment bag. It was nothing like what my mother would have chosen. No lace, no pearls, no sentimental echoes of family tradition. This was clean, structured, A-line with an architectural neckline and hand-stitched silk folds that looked like sculpture in motion. It was elegant but modern, exactly like I had imagined back when I still believed she'd help me pick it out. But standing there alone, I realized something. This was the first time in years I had chosen something without filtering it through their eyes, without asking if it was too much, or too loud, or not tasteful enough. It was just me. And in that moment, the dress stopped being about the wedding. It became a symbol. I slipped it on. It fit better than I remembered. I stepped into the light and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. The way the silk caught the morning sun made me pause, not because I looked perfect, but because I looked honest. The girl staring back wasn't performing for approval. She wasn't holding her breath for validation. She was present, whole, and astonishingly calm. Sasha walked in with coffee and froze. Her eyes welled up instantly. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You look like Justice." We laughed. I nearly spilled my champagne, and for the first time, the dress felt lived in, not like a costume or a burden, but a declaration. We spent the next 2 hours fine-tuning everything, hair pinned into a soft twist, makeup that highlighted my eyes without hiding the dark circles that had been earned. I told her I didn't want perfection, I wanted presence. Outside the suite, staff buzzed with floral arrangements, playlist checks, and beach seating prep. A light breeze rustled through the palm trees, sending petals dancing across the path. My phone stayed face down on the counter. No more waiting. Then came a knock. Not the photographer, not room service. It was Reed's mom. She stepped in, carrying a small white box and wearing a softness I hadn't expected. "This belonged to my mother," she said, placing the box on the dresser. Inside was a silver pin, shaped like a seashell. "She wore it at her wedding, and I want you to have it. Not because you need something borrowed, but because you already feel like family. Not just to Reed, but to all of us." I didn't cry until she left. Then it hit me all at once. How love could appear in places you never expected it. How family could be rebuilt from the kindness of strangers who chose you. I pinned the seashell beneath the fold of my gown, over my heart. When Sasha came back in with the final touch, the long, flowing veil, I felt a strange electricity run through me. Not nerves, power, not anticipation, readiness. I wasn't walking into this day as someone abandoned. I was walking in as someone who had survived, chosen well, and grown into herself despite every attempt to shrink her. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a reclamation, and I had never felt more beautiful. The breeze was warm and steady as I stepped onto the stone path leading to the beach. The gentle crash of waves harmonized with the soft string quartet playing a version of "Can't Help Falling in Love." Sunlight glinted on the water, catching the light fabric of my veil and making it dance behind me like a ribbon of memory. Everything was exactly as I had envisioned it, except for the front row. There were empty chairs, 6 of them to be exact. Right side, second row. Reserved, but not really. I had left them there on purpose, not with name cards or passive-aggressive placeholders, just quietly unfilled, like the emotional gaps they represented. I didn't want to honor their presence, so I honored their absence. Some guests glanced toward them, eyebrows raised with polite confusion. But no one asked. No one needed to. Those who mattered already knew, and those who didn't. Well, I wasn't carrying explanations today. I was carrying the train of my gown and the weight of my own peace. That was enough. That was everything. Every step I took felt earned. Not for show, not for spectacle, but like the closing of a chapter that had asked far too much of me. I remembered the sleepless nights, the emails ignored, the RSVP silence, the cruise photo, the Reed receipt. I thought about every moment I had questioned whether I was asking too much, when all I had ever wanted was to matter, and how strange it felt now to realize that by releasing their grip on my heart, I had found myself again. The aisle wasn't lined with approval. It was lined with chosen family, friends who had shown up again and again, Reed's cousins who brought the tequila shots at the bachelorette, my grad school roommate who flew cross-country despite being 7 months pregnant, even Aunt Linda, who caught my eye and gave the smallest, proudest nod. Sasha stood off to the side, beaming, mouthing the words, "You did it." I reached Reed, and he gently took my hands, whispering, "You made it." "I did," I breathed. "Without them." The officiant began. His words were poetic, grounding. He spoke of partnership, endurance, and choosing each other again and again, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He described love as an act of will, not just a feeling. I caught a glimpse of Sasha wiping her eyes, and I thought, yes, this is the kind of love that shows up, that endures, that heals. Reed and I read our vows. Mine had been rewritten the night after the cruise photo. Originally, I'd penned something about families blending, about legacies passed down, But that morning, I'd opened a new document. I wrote about forging something new, about love that repairs, not love that demands, about how sometimes the most radical act is not inviting everyone in, but knowing who to close the door on, and how sometimes the people who don't show up are doing you a favor. When we kissed, the crowd erupted, not in polite applause, but in full-bodied joy. Reed lifted my veil, and the breeze swept through just as the musicians transitioned into an upbeat jazz riff. We turned to walk back down the aisle together, hand in hand, the ocean sparkling behind us. The empty seats remained. But this time I didn't see them as absence. I saw them as boundaries. And they were beautiful. The sun dipped lower as the reception began, casting golden hues across the open-air terrace overlooking the water. The tables were draped in linen the color of vanilla bean, and tiny lights wound through the pergolas above, glittering like bottled stars. The scent of salt, jasmine, and roasted citrus chicken swirled in the air as guests took their seats. I tried to soak it all in. Reed's warm hand in mine, the gentle clinking of glasses, the sound of laughter floating around us, but a quiet thrum in my chest reminded me this wasn't over. The toasts began. First came Sasha, poised, radiant, the kind of friend who'd bleed quietly beside you if it meant you could walk taller. Her voice trembled only once when she looked at me and said, "Some people show love by showing up." "Sophia? You showed us how to stand tall, even when no one's clapping." The crowd cheered, and I blinked back tears, wishing I could bottle that feeling of being understood so fully. Then came Reed's brother, Tyler, who cracked a joke about Reed's infamous failed pancake breakfast on their second date. We all laughed, including me. It was warm and lighthearted, exactly the kind of familial joy I'd always craved. Then Reed stood. The moment he lifted his champagne glass, the crowd quieted. He took a breath and looked at me, not just as his bride, but as the person who had weathered so many storms to be here. "Sophia," he said, "I've seen you rise, not once, but every time someone tried to dim your light. What people don't know is that this woman redefined strength for me." He paused. "She didn't just plan this wedding. She reimagined what family could look like. And when her own walked away, she still stood here today, full of love, not bitterness, grace, not grudges." A quiet hush settled, the kind that follows truth too deep for applause. Reed continued, voice steadier now. "I watched her write new vows not just for us, but for herself. She taught me that love isn't just who shows up, it's how we show up. And for the rest of my life, I want to be the kind of man who always shows up for you." I couldn't stop the tears this time, but they weren't from grief. They were from the strange joy of being witnessed, completely. The room erupted as he ended his toast, and we clinked glasses with what felt like our real beginning. And then, like a chill creeping through a window left ajar, a voice spoke up behind me. "I hope the seating chart was worth it." I turned. It was my cousin Hannah. She wore a dress too formal for the vibe, and a smirk that hinted she hadn't come to celebrate. She sipped her wine and added, "Some of us thought maybe this could be the moment your parents walked in." A surprise? A gesture? No? I held her gaze and replied quietly, "No." And it was never going to be. She blinked, clearly not expecting that. "You really didn't think to leave room for reconciliation?" I let the silence stretch between us like a truth too big to speak. "Hannah, I left 6 chairs empty. That's more grace than they earned." And I turned away. It was a small exchange, but my body felt it like an aftershock. I went back to Reed, back to the toasts, the joy, the music. But somewhere in my chest, my heart beat differently now. Not faster, just clearer. It was strange how pain could still echo inside celebration, but maybe that was the point. Maybe weddings weren't supposed to be perfect. Maybe they were mirrors, showing you who really stood beside you when it mattered most. And as the night swelled into dancing, I looked around at the laughter, the clinking glasses, the barefoot guests swaying under the string lights. My parents weren't here, but my people were, and that made all the difference. After the dancing began and the reception lights dimmed to a golden glow, I slipped away to a quieter corner of the venue where a wooden table stood by the entrance. There it was, the Guestbook, a creamy, leather-bound album embossed with our initials and the date, its pages crisp and waiting, not just for names but for moments, for memories, for grace. I ran my fingers across the cover before opening to the first page. Notes were already spilling in. Joyous, weepy, hilarious. To the fiercest bride and the softest heart. May you always dance barefoot and laugh loudly. Thanks for reminding us what real love looks like. Each message left a small imprint, each signature a confirmation that yes, people showed up, not just physically, but emotionally. I turned another page and saw a tiny sketch Reed's little niece had drawn of us under the arch, complete with a veil that looked more like a jellyfish and a heart as big as her tiny fist. I smiled. This was what mattered. But it was impossible not to wonder what might have been scrawled in my mother's handwriting. Would she have written something neutral? Something sharp? Something that tried to sound like love but reeked of guilt? And my father, would he have signed his name and nothing more, just to make a point? Would he have tried to take credit for the woman I'd become? I pressed my fingers to the blank space where their entries should have been. It wasn't grief anymore. It was recognition. They hadn't just skipped the ceremony, they'd skipped the part that required reflection, humility, love, and this book, they'd never get to write in it. Not now, not ever. Just then, Sasha joined me, holding a glass of dessert wine. You okay? I nodded, then shook my head. I keep looking at these pages, wondering what it would have felt like to read something from them. Sasha placed her glass down, then gently turned the page. You already did. Every missed call, every excuse, every empty seat. That was their message. And you, my dear, rewrote it. I smiled, letting the truth settle between us. Then I picked up a pen. I wrote a message to myself on the final page. Dear Sophia, this is the day you stopped waiting. This is the moment you understood you are enough, even without applause from the cheap seats. This is the story you'll read years from now, not about who was missing but about how present you became. I closed the book. Later that night, Reed and I walked barefoot along the shore. The reception behind us glowed faintly in the distance, laughter and jazz mixing with the rhythmic hush of waves. We said little. We didn't need to. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded note. You left this at the gift table. Want me to read it to you? I blinked. I hadn't left a note. He unfolded the paper and began. Dear Sophia, if you're reading this, you've already done the hard thing. You walked down that aisle. You stood your ground, and you claimed your day. I'm proud of you. I'm proud to stand next to you. Love, future you. I looked at him. You wrote that? He smiled. Number you did. 2 months ago. Sasha found it in your planner and thought today was the day to bring it out. The ocean stretched before us like a promise too wide to hold, and for the first time that day I laughed. Not because everything had gone right, but because finally, I had chosen myself. The next morning, the sunrise over the water looked like something from a dream I hadn't dared to imagine months ago. Soft orange and gold kissed the horizon, and the ocean shimmered like it was exhaling, like even it had stayed up all night celebrating. Reed and I packed slowly. No rush, no tension, no silence we had to fill. I sat on the edge of the bed and ran my hands across the soft silk of my robe, the same robe I'd worn when I got ready for the wedding, the same robe my mother was supposed to have gifted me, but never did. I had chosen it myself, bought it with my own money, wrapped it myself. It was a small act, but somehow it mattered more now. Reed came over, placed a hand gently on my shoulder, and kissed the top of my head. Want to grab breakfast before the car comes? Yes, but let's take the long way down. I want one last walk around the grounds. The resort was quiet in the early light. Palm trees swayed lazily, birds chirped, and the scent of hibiscus clung to the air. We strolled hand in hand past the reception space, now empty, its magic tucked away like a secret between the ocean and sky. My heels had once clicked across those tiles. My laughter had echoed off those walls. At the garden gate, Reed paused. "You know, I was nervous the whole time. Not about marrying you, just worried someone would ruin it for you." I looked at him. "They didn't show up, Reed. That was their choice, but the day wasn't ruined. It was redefined." We stopped by the koi pond, and I leaned in close to watch the fish swirl beneath the lily pads. "I used to think a wedding was a promise you made to everyone, that you'd live up to their expectations, make them proud. Now I know it's just a mirror. It shows you who can celebrate your joy without needing to own it." Reed slipped his arm around me. "And who sees your light and doesn't try to dim it." We sat for a while just breathing, no hurry, no makeup, no posing, just being. The flight home was quiet. I sat by the window. Reed dozed off beside me, his hand warm on my armrest. I pulled out my phone to scroll through the photos from the night before, the dancing, the toasts, the guestbook. I stopped at the image of the empty chairs. At first I felt the old pang again, that old ache. But then I zoomed out, and what I saw was different. 6 empty chairs in a sea of celebration. The contrast was sharp, yes, but it also made something else stand out. All the filled ones, all the people who had shown up, who had traveled miles, who'd cried during the vows, who'd stayed late to pack up flowers and shoes and wine glasses. That image, I saved. Not for what it lacked, but for what it held. Later, when we landed, Reed turned to me. "Ready to start our life?" I smiled. "We already did. But yes, let's go home." And home didn't feel like the place we left. It felt like the one we were building. When we got back to the city, everything felt louder. The cab rides, the traffic, the clatter of keys as we opened the apartment door. But the silence, the kind that followed us into our hallway, our inboxes, our voicemail, was the one that rang the loudest. There were no messages waiting, no delayed congratulations, no sudden change of heart, not even a misplaced gift or half-hearted apology. My parents hadn't reached out at all. Neither had my brother or sister-in-law. It was like they had collectively decided to let the wedding vanish into some untouchable space in time, as if by pretending it hadn't happened, they could undo it. It was sobering, more than the empty chairs, more than the missing toasts. This absence of acknowledgement, it was deafening. Reed kept looking at me every time I checked my phone. He didn't say anything at first, but one evening, as we unpacked gifts in our living room surrounded by floral-scented cards and ribbons, he paused with a ribbon in his hand. "You sure you want to keep checking?" he asked gently. I let out a breath. "I don't know. Maybe I'm not looking for them to apologize. Maybe I'm still hoping they'll just see me." He nodded and didn't press. That was his gift to me. Space without abandonment. A week later, a letter arrived. Not a call, not a visit, a plain white envelope with no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's. I stared at it for what felt like forever before opening it. The letter was short, formal, not cruel, but cold. She said she hoped the wedding had been what I wanted. She added that the family felt deeply hurt by my decision to move forward without their blessing, and that she hoped I could understand their perspective. Not once did she ask how I felt. Not once did she acknowledge what she'd done. And then came the final line. "We love you in our own way, but we will not be a part of choices that go against our values." I folded the paper slowly. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it away. I placed it back in the envelope, walked to the kitchen, and tucked it into the drawer with old coupons and expired batteries. Somewhere forgettable, somewhere harmless, because I was done giving it power. That night, I posted a wedding photo on social media, one of me laughing mid-dance, Reed dipping me slightly, my head thrown back, joy radiating from every pixel. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't make a pointed caption. I just wrote, "The beginning of us." Within minutes, the comments rolled in. Friends, distant cousins, co-workers, even my high school English teacher. Messages of love, of celebration, of real, unconditional presence. And still, nothing from my parents. Sasha called that weekend. "How's the silence treating you?" I laughed softly. "It's finally honest." She paused. "Do you regret not confronting them before the wedding?" I thought about that. I did, for a while. But now? Number. They made their choice. I just gave them the space to show it. There was something freeing about that. Knowing I hadn't cut them off, they had just chosen not to walk through the door I left open. Later that evening, Reed and I put on music and slow danced in the kitchen, just because. There was no crowd, no applause, no obligation. Just us. And that, I realized, was the only blessing I needed. The weeks that followed our wedding were wrapped in a kind of stillness I had never known before. It wasn't eerie or empty. It was the kind of stillness that follows a storm when the air is sharp with clarity, when every object feels exactly where it belongs. The wedding had passed, the social media posts had been shared, the congratulatory texts came in droves, from everyone except my family. And still, I wasn't unraveling. If anything, I was becoming. I began waking up earlier, not because I had things to do, but because I wanted to greet the day on my own terms. I'd pad into the kitchen in fuzzy socks, light a candle, and wrap my fingers around a mug of coffee, staring out at the morning light as it crept between buildings. Sometimes I'd read, sometimes I'd just sit in silence. I wasn't trying to escape my thoughts, I was honoring them. Reed noticed the shift. One morning he handed me a plate of warm pancakes and studied my face like it was something new. "You're glowing lately," he said, brushing a crumb from my cheek. I laughed. I feel like my skin finally fits. Clearing out wedding boxes one afternoon, I found the Guestbook again. I hadn't opened it since we came home. I sat on the living room floor, legs folded beneath me, and flipped through the pages slowly. Each note was a tiny constellation of love, jokes from college friends, warm wishes from coworkers, sketches from my cousin's kids. But what stopped me was the last page. Sasha had written something I hadn't seen during the reception, bold and looping across the bottom. "They didn't miss your wedding, they missed the privilege of being there." That sentence lodged itself in my chest. She was right. My parents hadn't just declined to attend, they had forfeited the honor of witnessing my life in its most joyful moment. That was their loss, not mine. It wasn't my job to make them feel comfortable while they watched me choose something different. I closed the book, not with pain, but with reverence. I was done begging for love that came with conditions. A few days later, an invitation arrived in the mail. Pastel envelope, baby elephant stickers, the works. It was a baby shower for my cousin Ava. Not from my parents directly, but clearly orchestrated by them. It felt like bait, an olive branch wrapped in social obligation, a chance to appear polite without having to address the mess they made. Reed glanced at the envelope and raised an eyebrow. "You going?" I turned it over in my hands. "No." "Want to talk about it?" I shook my head. "I'm not saying no to be spiteful. I'm saying no because I have nothing left to prove. I don't need to show up to earn their approval." That Sunday, instead of attending the shower, I went to the botanical garden with Sasha. The late summer sun was kind, filtering through rose trellises and bathing the paths in honeyed light. We walked slowly, taking in the hydrangeas and winding paths. The air smelled like growth, like soil and sweetness. It was exactly what I needed. As we passed a lily pond, I told her about the invitation. She didn't react with indignation. She didn't even offer advice. She just said, "You chose peace. That's a better RSVP than any gift you could have brought." That line stuck with me all day. Later that evening, Reed and I went to our favorite Italian restaurant, the one with the squeaky booth in the back and the overly generous bread basket. We ordered our usual garlic knots, house salad, spaghetti to split. As we clinked glasses over cheap red wine, I felt something land inside me, like all the pieces had clicked into place. "This feels like home," I said softly. He smiled. It is. I leaned across the table and took his hand. Thank you. For what? For being my family, even when mine stepped back. He didn't hesitate. I didn't step in to replace them. I stepped in because you deserved to be seen. That night, as we walked home under string lights that lined the neighborhood cafe patios, I looked up at the stars and thought about how many nights I'd spent asking for acceptance, how many years I'd measured my worth against silence, disappointment, cold letters, and withheld embraces, and here I was, laughing, full, loved, and no longer waiting for someone to catch up. When we got home, I opened the drawer where I'd stashed my mother's letter. I didn't reread it. I simply pulled it out, walked to the recycling bin, and dropped it in without ceremony. Because I didn't need it anymore. The real wedding gift hadn't come wrapped in tissue paper or tied with ribbon. It had come in the form of a door I'd quietly closed, a line I'd drawn not in sand, but in stone. I had married the man I loved. I had stood tall in my own truth, and in doing so, I had chosen peace. We didn't plan a honeymoon right away. Between the emotional whiplash of the wedding and the silence that followed, we needed time to breathe. But after a few weeks of quiet mornings and gentle routines, Reed brought it up one evening while we were folding laundry. "How do you feel about a road trip?" he asked, holding up a t-shirt and smiling like he already knew the answer. "A road trip?" I raised an eyebrow. "Not a glamorous flight or a resort," he clarified. "Just the two of us, somewhere with nature, mountains, air we don't have to share with thousands of people." It sounded perfect. We picked Colorado, a cabin tucked into the Rockies with a wraparound porch, no cell service, and a fireplace we'd have to learn how to use. It wasn't the typical honeymoon destination, but then again, nothing about our wedding had been typical. The drive was long, but peaceful. We packed our favorite snacks, made a playlist of songs that had scored our love story, and talked more deeply than we had in months. Without deadlines or detours, the road opened space we didn't know we needed. We laughed about childhood stories, revisited the early days of our relationship, and made up ridiculous names for the towns we passed. When we arrived, the air smelled like pine and something wilder. The cabin was older than the photos made it look, but there was a charm in its uneven floorboards and creaky steps. The first night, Reed built a fire that barely caught, and we huddled in sweaters, giggling at our lack of survival skills. We ate instant noodles on the floor, wrapped in blankets, and toasted with mismatched mugs. It was imperfect. It was everything. The next morning, I stepped outside onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee. The sky stretched wide and endless. The silence wasn't empty here. It was rich, full of life humming under the surface. I felt my chest expand in a way it hadn't for years. I wasn't bracing anymore. Reed joined me, slipping his arm around my waist. "You okay?" I nodded. "I think I'm more than okay." That week became our sanctuary. We hiked trails lined with golden aspens, sat by the river with our feet in the water, and cooked clumsy meals over a gas stove that barely worked. Every evening we read books by the fire or slow danced to old records we found in the cabin's tiny collection. There were no calls, no obligations, just us. On the third day, I pulled out a notebook I'd packed and began to write. Not a journal, not letters, but something in between. I wrote down what I remembered about the wedding, every color, every moment, every laugh. But I also wrote about the ache. I wrote about the empty seats, the letter from my mother, the coldness that had wrapped itself around my family like a second skin. And then I wrote about now. I wrote about the sound of Reed's laughter echoing through the trees, the way the sun warmed our porch in the late afternoons, and the sudden, startling joy of being fully myself. I filled pages each morning, sometimes in silence, sometimes narrating to Reed as he made coffee or chopped vegetables. It wasn't for publication, it wasn't to prove a point. It was just mine. Toward the end of the week, we climbed to a lookout point the cabin owner had marked on the trail map. The view was breathtaking, a wide stretch of valley, golden trees scattered like confetti, and a sky so blue it felt like fiction. We sat on a boulder in silence, holding hands, the wind threading through our hair. I used to think peace was something I'd feel after fixing everything, I said. Reed turned to me. And now? Now I think peace is what you feel when you stop needing to. He kissed the back of my hand. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard you say. When we packed up the cabin to leave, I left my notebook in the drawer beside the bed. Not because I didn't want it anymore, but because I no longer needed to hold it so tightly. It had done its work. It had held space for everything I couldn't say out loud. Now I was ready to carry it in me instead. On the drive home, we didn't talk as much. Not out of distance, but because the silence between us was full of knowing. We were heading back into the world, back to jobs, to city streets, to the occasional unexpected letter, but something had shifted. We weren't coming back as the people who had left. We returned lighter, rooted, married not just in name, but in rhythm. This wasn't the honeymoon I'd imagined when I first dreamed of white dresses and long guest lists, but it was the one we needed. A honeymoon healing journey that didn't just celebrate the beginning of our marriage. It mended the parts of ourselves we hadn't even realized were still waiting to be held. And that, in the end, was the greatest destination of all. We were home less than 2 weeks when the letter arrived. It wasn't the kind of envelope that screamed drama. No urgent handwriting, no heavy perfume or overly ornate stationery. It was plain, cream-colored, no return address, just my full name written in my mother's looping cursive. The sight of it made my throat close. I stared at it on the counter for 3 days before Reed finally said, "Do you want me to open it for you?" I shook my head. "I'll do it. When I'm ready." I waited until a Friday night. Reed had gone to dinner with a colleague, and I was alone with a soft blanket, warm tea, and an odd mix of dread and determination. I slit the envelope open with a butter knife and pulled out the letter, expecting cruelty or worse, manipulation in the form of faux regret. But it wasn't that. It was something stranger. She wrote of disappointment, not in me, but in herself. She claimed she didn't know how to face me after everything, that she and my father had felt left out of the wedding process and acted out of defensiveness, that they were embarrassed, that their trip to Europe had been booked in a moment of pettiness, and they didn't think I'd go through with the ceremony without them. I wanted to scoff, but I also knew something true. It was hard to undo decades of dysfunction. People rarely know how to apologize well when they were never taught to own mistakes. I folded the letter, set it down, and let myself cry. Not from sadness or anger, but because I no longer needed them to say the perfect thing. I didn't need this letter to make me feel whole. That power had quietly shifted somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. Still, I wasn't done. That Sunday, we hosted a brunch for our closest friends. Sasha brought cinnamon rolls. Reed's cousin brought flowers. Everyone gathered in the backyard, laughter like music between the trees. And just before we toasted, I brought out the letter. "I want to read you something," I said, voice steady. Reed stood beside me, one hand at the small of my back. I read the letter aloud, not to shame my parents, but to reclaim the narrative, to show the people who had supported us what silence sounds like when it breaks. When I finished, there was a long pause. No one clapped, no one cried. They just sat with me in the truth of it. And then Sasha said, "You're so brave, but more than that, you're free." I folded the letter and placed it in a small box I'd labeled, "Things I've Outgrown." It joined other relics, old receipts from family holidays, emails I used to reread trying to decode affection, and a broken brooch my mother once gave me, then asked to borrow back. Later that night, Reed asked me, "Why now? Why read it?" "Because I used to think healing was private," I said. "But maybe it's not. Maybe it's something we do with witnesses. People who say, 'I saw you survive. I saw you stay kind anyway.'" He kissed my forehead and whispered, "Then let them keep seeing." The next morning, I drafted a reply to my mother. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even long. It said, "I received your letter. Thank you for sending it. I'm finding peace in my life, not because of what happened or didn't happen, but because I chose to stop waiting for someone else to offer it to me. I hope one day we can speak with more truth and less fear. But until then, I wish you well." I didn't send it right away. I let it sit. Let myself sit. In the meantime, Reed and I framed one of the wedding photos. Not the posed ones, but a candid, us under fairy lights, laughing so hard our eyes were closed. It now hung in our living room. Because despite the letters, the silences, the missing seats, this was our story. Not broken, just rewritten. 3 weeks after reading my mother's letter aloud at brunch, something in me changed. It wasn't dramatic or immediate. It was subtle, like a curtain being drawn back and realizing the sun had been rising behind it all along. The ache wasn't gone entirely, but it no longer owned my mornings. I had stopped checking my phone for messages that would never come. I stopped rereading the letter. I stopped wondering if maybe I had overreacted or if I should have done more to make them feel included. The questions that used to haunt me now felt like echoes from a version of myself I had already outgrown. Reed noticed, too. He didn't mention it outright, but he started calling me Sunshine again, a nickname he'd given me early in our relationship when I'd laugh just a little too loudly in public. I had stopped laughing like that for a while, shrinking myself so the people I loved wouldn't feel small around me. Not anymore. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning out the hallway closet, I found an old photo album tucked behind some blankets. It was a family album, our family vacations, school plays, awkward teenage birthdays. I hesitated before opening it, knowing it might tug at the tender edges I had only just begun to reinforce. But I did. There we were. A family that looked picture-perfect, my mother holding a cake with my name on it, my father with a camera always around his neck, my brother smirking in every photo like he knew something we didn't, and me, smiling, eager, always reaching toward someone else's approval with my eyes. I didn't cry. I didn't slam the album shut. I simply turned page after page, remembering the girl in those photos, and whispering to her in my head, "You made it. Look at you now." After dinner that night, I brought the album to Reed. "These are our ghosts," I said, setting it in his lap. He flipped through it slowly, nodding. "They don't scare me." "They don't scare me anymore either." We decided to box it up, not destroy it, just store it somewhere safe. We didn't need it out in the open. We had built something new that no longer depended on those images to feel real. That following week, I got another letter, this time from my father. It was short. A few lines about legacy and tradition. No apology. Just a reminder that doors can stay open if pride doesn't close them. I reread it twice before placing it back in the envelope. Then I did something I never imagined I'd have the courage to do. I walked to the front door of our apartment, opened the trash bin, and dropped the letter inside. I didn't hesitate. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn it over in my mind or wonder how it might be interpreted. I just let it go. Because that door, the one they thought they could leave open for convenience, I had already closed it. And for the first time in my life, I felt strong enough to keep it shut. That weekend, Reed and I visited a local artist market. I bought a painting that looked nothing like my old style. Abstract, chaotic, full of orange and teal swirls like a storm with a heartbeat. I hung it in our bedroom, right above the dresser. "It looks like the inside of your mind," Reed said, half joking. "Exactly," I replied. "Messy, alive, and finally mine." We spent the evening on the couch, eating takeout, watching a documentary about coral reefs, and falling asleep halfway through. I woke up curled beside him, the soft glow of the hallway light behind us, and I thought, this is what safe feels like. Not quiet, not perfect, just real. And real was enough. 3 weeks after reading my mother's letter aloud at brunch, something in me changed. It wasn't dramatic or immediate. It was subtle, like a curtain being drawn back and realizing the sun had been rising behind it all along. The ache wasn't gone entirely, but it no longer owned my mornings. I had stopped checking my phone for messages that would never come. I stopped rereading the letter. I stopped wondering if maybe I had overreacted or if I should have done more to make them feel included. The questions that used to haunt me now felt like echoes from a version of myself I had already outgrown. Reed noticed, too. He didn't mention it outright, but he started calling me Sunshine again, a nickname he'd given me early in our relationship when I'd laugh just a little too loudly in public. I had stopped laughing like that for a while, shrinking myself so the people I loved wouldn't feel small around me. Not anymore. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning out the hallway closet, I found an old photo album tucked behind some blankets. It was a family album, our family vacations, school plays, awkward teenage birthdays. I hesitated before opening it, knowing it might tug at the tender edges I had only just begun to reinforce. But I did. There we were. A family that looked picture-perfect, my mother holding a cake with my name on it, my father with a camera always around his neck, my brother smirking in every photo like he knew something we didn't, and me, smiling, eager, always reaching toward someone else's approval with my eyes. I didn't cry. I didn't slam the album shut. I simply turned page after page, remembering the girl in those photos, and whispering to her in my head, "You made it. Look at you now." After dinner that night, I brought the album to read. "These are our ghosts," I said, setting it in his lap. He flipped through it slowly, nodding. "They don't scare me." "They don't scare me anymore either." We decided to box it up, not destroy it, just store it somewhere safe. We didn't need it out in the open. We had built something new that no longer depended on those images to feel real. That following week, I got another letter, this time from my father. It was short. A few lines about legacy and tradition. No apology. Just a reminder that doors can stay open if pride doesn't close them. I reread it twice before placing it back in the envelope. Then I did something I never imagined I'd have the courage to do. I walked to the front door of our apartment, opened the trash bin, and dropped the letter inside. I didn't hesitate. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn it over in my mind or wonder how it might be interpreted. I just let it go. Because that door, the one they thought they could leave open for convenience, I had already closed it. And for the first time in my life, I felt strong enough to keep it shut. That weekend, Reed and I visited a local artist market. I bought a painting that looked nothing like my old style. Abstract, chaotic, full of orange and teal swirls like a storm with a heartbeat. I hung it in our bedroom, right above the dresser. "It looks like the inside of your mind," Reed said, half joking. "Exactly," I replied. "Messy, alive, and finally mine." We spent the evening on the couch, eating takeout, watching a documentary about coral reefs, and falling asleep halfway through. I woke up curled beside him, the soft glow of the hallway light behind us, and I thought, this is what safe feels like. Not quiet, not perfect, just real. And real was enough.